Good morning, everyone. At least I hope it's a good morning. I'm not sure what time zones everyone is in, but I will tell you it is 8 a.m. in sunny California, and I will have trouble remembering my name during portions of this panel, so please bear with me. I'm Isabel Schechter. I am the moderator for this panel. We've got a nice diverse experience on the panel, and so I think we're all going to be hearing some interesting things today. I want to introduce myself and then have our panelists introduce themselves, and then we will get right into it with some questions and explorations. As I said, my name is Isabel Schechter. I have been in fandom just over 20 years. I have run conventions. I have been on panels. I have written essays on race and representation in science fiction and fantasy. I am Puerto Rican and I am Jewish. I'm also vegetarian and Midwestern and a whole lot of other things. And they all coexist very happily. Well, maybe that Southern California resident and Midwestern gal, not so much, but that's okay. I work on that. Okay, and so if we can go, Daniel, I'm just going to go alphabetically by first name. Daniel, if you can introduce yourself.
Okay, my name's Dan Kimmel. Good morning, everyone, or wherever you are. I'm a film critic, longtime film critic, and you may know me for my collection of essays on science fiction movies, Jar Jar Binks Must Die. I also do a continuing column for Space and Time magazine. I also have, in recent years, moved into writing fiction, and I'll just plug my latest novel, which is what got me here, which is Father of the Bride of Frankenstein, in which the monster marries into a Jewish family and decides to convert. And if appropriate, I can talk more about that. But I very definitely want to touch on Jewish humor in science fiction.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I forgot to ask us to, if we want to include any, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I'm not awake. Any of our social media handles and any of our links to books should be in the chat, and our chat wrangler will be putting them into Discord. So if you're following along in the Discord, you will see those in there. Also, if everyone would like to use their pronouns or introduce themselves with their pronouns, mine are she and her. All right, Jillian, if you can go next.
Mine is she and her too, and since people are talking time zones, it's 1:03 in the morning here, and Monday is safe. You don't have to worry. I'm still alive and it's Monday. I'm Australian, just in case that wasn't really patently obvious. My the reason I'm probably on this panel is this book, which is the first Australian Jewish fantasy. Australian Judaism is significantly different to US Judaism, which should come up in discussion, I hope. I'm also a medieval historian and an ethno-historian. I specialize in what culture goes into narratives and why and how it's interpreted. But mostly what culture that goes into narratives and why. What else do you need to know about me? Oh, there's too much. I'm an Anglo-Australian Jewish with combined Sephardi and Ashkenazi heritage. And if anybody wants me to, and my Latin is better than my Hebrew, and my Yiddish I only know because my nephews learned it at school. And that's it.
Stephen.
Hi, I'm Stephen Silver. I've been around fandom and science fiction for decades, dating back to the 1980s. I'm best known probably as a fan writer, although I have been publishing fiction for the last 12 years. I've also worked as a publisher for about 8 years. I ran NASFiC Press. Most recently, I published my first novel last month, actually, after Hastings. I'll be doing a reading from that immediately after this panel. The reason I'm on here is way back in the dark ages of the internet, before you actually had the World Wide Web, when we were all on Usenet and it was all text-based, I started to maintain a bibliography of what I consider to be Jewish-themed science fiction. And we'll get into what that means a little bit later, and everybody can argue with each other, because that's what we do. That bibliography eventually migrated to the web, where you can still find it, and the link is in the Discord. Back in 2004, I wrote an article, the entry on Jewish science fiction for the Encyclopedia of American Jewish History. And about 2 years ago, I wrote an article on Jewish science fiction for Uncanny Magazine.
Okay, great. And Valerie.
Hello, I'm Valerie Estelle Frankel, she, her. I've written about 80 books analyzing Doctor Who, Game of Thrones, Star Wars, all that kind of stuff, and have such fun with it. There go my links on Discord. And I wrote what I was hoping would be a cute, short little book about Jewish science fiction. I'd get it out in a month and move on like I do with all these others. The book is currently 450,000 words, which is the length of 4 big academic books. I just found a publisher for it, and they said, okay, why don't we make this into like a 20-book series, and you could get some other academic books and essays and anthologies from other people. So the call for papers just went up in the Discord if you would like to send me something. But the punchline really is I have lately read just about every Jewish science fiction I could get my hands on and have been frantically digging up more from obscure sources.
Okay. All right. So before we get started talking about all the Jewish science fiction we love and hate, we think it's a good idea to actually define what we mean when we say Jewish science fiction. And so we're going to talk about does the fact that the author is Jewish make something automatically Jewish science fiction? Is it the subject matter? Is it the thematic elements? And so this time I'm going to go in reverse order. Valerie, what makes a story Jewish to you?
I'm going to go with the nebulous, I know it when I see it, because where the wild things are is not labeled Jewish. There are no characters identifying as Jewish, but the Jewish author wrote it about his hairy, slobbering relatives who would cover him in kisses and say they were going to eat him up. So it's really easy to see some stuff in it. Likewise, Lemony Snicket wrote a book called Why Is This Night Different from All Other Nights? Again, no Jewish characters, no really overt Jewish themes, nobody celebrates Hanukkah, but with a title like that, yeah, he's writing it as a shout out to us. So I'm putting that in there.
Okay. Stephen.
Okay, so no, just because the author is Jewish doesn't mean it's Jewish science fiction. In fact, the novel I published last month is emphatically not Jewish science fiction. It's very much grounded in medieval Christianity. When I wrote the article for the Encyclopedia for the Jewish Encyclopedia, I was very much thinking, what does it mean for something to be Jewish science fiction? And I divided Jewish science fiction into 4 categories. One of them is it's Jewish in name only. You know, it has a Jewish character or something like that, but the Jewish character really could be anybody. There's no Jewishness about it, except maybe one character who happens to be Jewish, but could be of any religion. The second category was Jewish for comic effect, bringing in a Jewish sensibility of humor. This is the kind of thing that, Valerie was referring to a little bit, in Where the Wild Things Are. And it comes out of the Borscht Belt, really, in a big way. The third one is wish fulfillment. A lot of Jewish alternate history falls into this category. What if the Holocaust hadn't happened? What if the diaspora didn't happen? What if the kingdom of Khazaria had managed to survive as a Jewish entity? And then finally, it's Jewish science fiction that deals with the serious topics. And of course, there can be overlap between them. Jack Dan's Jumping the Road, I think, falls into both the humorous category and the serious one. So does William Tenn's On Venus Have We Got a Rabbi, where they look at, serious topics that affect the Jewish religion, the Jewish people, and beyond, but also bring in the Jewish sense of humor.
Great. Jillian.
I had to say things differently because when you're working in North America, you're in the center of world Jewish science fiction as it is. So you're the mainstream, you're the white Jewish. Australia is considerably different. New Zealand had a prime minister who wrote a Jewish novel because he was Jewish and he put the right sort of themes in. I checked with Lucy Sussex over that because I didn't interpret it quite the same way, but she interpreted it as consciously Jewish. So if Sir Julius Vogel did it, then we're not guilty about not being publicly Jewish in Australasia. It just is communicated differently because we are a minority in the world Jewish communities. We're many minorities, actually. We're quite diverse. So I've taken to thinking of it as a spectrum. You can't say this is Jewish, this isn't Jewish. You have to look at each novel and evaluate where it is in a complex spectrum. So, for example, I'll take 2 works to explain it, if I can remember. 2 of my own works, because I'm evil that way, and because there aren't many Australian New Zealand writers to call on. There's 4 Australian and 1 dead New Zealander, that's it. So I'll call upon a living Australian, and she's me because it's easier that way. So what I did with Time of the Ghosts was I decided that what would happen if you wrote a fantasy novel where it was permitted to be magic and Jewish, not magic and Jewish. The whole Western European and Eastern Central European fairy stories and popular stories included us rather than excluded us in the telling. And what would happen if that was brought to Australia? So for those novels, that means it's challenging how we tell Jewish history. It's saying we don't have to be excluded. We exclude ourselves sometimes in the way we tell things. So it's a very, my continuum is very complex. And my token gift to Jewish humor is only very mildly funny, but it's a French Jewish superhero novel with alternate universes and comes out next year in America by a press that's I Gotta Have It, which is a brand new one. And the fact that an Australian novel has appeal to American audiences is considered by a publisher appeal means we're talking about a spectrum and we're talking about a complicated one. So Stephen, in case you need to know, it's called The Green Children Help Out. And the alternate universe exists. Britain, England in particular, has 30% of Jews. I mean, not 30% of world Judaism, 30% of England is Jewish.
Right, which will also make it
Wow.
eligible for the Sidewise Award.
I've been longlisted for the Sidewise Award twice, and no one ever shortlists me because my stuff is different. I just don't fit in any categories. So what I'm saying is where you have too few writers, you can't classify. All you can do is say complex spectrum. Where is it likely to fit if you had more writers?
And we're going to talk more about complexity and minority status in a second. Daniel, I want to get your take though first on what defines.
Okay, well, for those of us of a certain age, and Steve mentioned the story from it, but I get the name, the book is an anthology called Wandering Stars, which was the first anthology of Jewish science fiction. And obviously there was, there were Jewish science fiction writers long before that, but that was the first time somebody had collected a bunch of stories thematically because there was some Jewish content to it. And there were a number of writers in there who are of Jewish backgrounds, so like Isaac Asimov or Harlan Ellison, who didn't, they were not observant Jews. Asimov, in fact, I think ultimately defined himself as a humanist. And yet they acknowledge their heritage, in some of these stories. The William Tenn story, I got to interview him when he was the guest of honor at the World Science Fiction Convention in Boston back 2001 or 2 or whenever it was. In any case, he had the one original story that was commissioned for that volume. And for years thereafter, he would go around and do speaking engagements where he would read the story with the original cantillation. And if for people who are not familiar with this story, On Venus Do We Have a Rabbi, definitely worth tracking down. But he told me there's a joke in there that I had read the story many times. I hadn't caught until he told me. He uses the names of a number of Yiddish writers in the story, but the main character is named Milchig, and he's a TV repairman. They make a point, he's a TV repairman. And he said, well, because he was trying to do a tribute to Shalom Aleichem without actually mentioning Shalom Aleichem name. And so the main character is the inverse of Tevye the milker, the milkman. And so it became Milchig the TV repairman.
That's great.
Ted also told me that he used to sneak Yiddish words into his stories when he needed some alien concept. And the first time he did that, I think it was for Galaxy, for Horace Gold, who was his editor, who was Jewish. And he pointed that out, and he said, Gold's response was, thank you for pointing that out, I'll take it out. And so after that, he stopped telling him, and the stuff went right through.
Okay, so I think I feel the same way about each of what each of our panelists has said so far about the definition of Jewish sci-fi. There are plenty of people who are by background Jewish, or who were raised in a Jewish home, whether or not they actively believe or practice Judaism. But that alone does not make something Jewish to me. For me, it has to do with what the content or what the themes are. The best example of this is Ted Chiang wrote a short story, which is completely out of my brain right now, of course. But he wrote a story about a golem. And Stephen,
72 letters.
Thank you, 72 letters. And it is an incredibly Jewish story. If I gave it to you to read and didn't tell you that it was Ted Chiang, you would assume that a Jewish person had written this. It is excellently researched. His facts are dead on. The feeling that it evokes when he says certain things, the concept of saying the name of God and the power that has, that strikes, into the heart, into my heart, about what being Jewish is and the power of the word of God, really. And so that story is an incredibly Jewish story, and it's told by an Asian man. Right. And so who the author is not what's relevant to me. It's what the story is about. And picking up on what Jillian said about being a minority group, I think that the idea that someone completely removed from what you would think of being in the group of that you would define as Jews really speaks to how far Jews have come, I guess, in terms of being this oppressed minority to being a group of people who, for good or for bad, are our culture, our religion is something that people are talking about and writing stories about, and doing so in a good way. And so I really love what Ted did with that story. And if you haven't read it, I really recommend it. Getting back to what Jillian said, though, about the minority and about the white Judaism, that word kind of.
I did it on purpose. In Australia, I call myself off-white because we were honoring blacks in the White Australia policy. So the whole US black-white thing is different here. And I just wanted to make sure it was clear that it's different here.
Okay, yeah. It's so here in the States, we have this, and probably elsewhere, we have this idea that Jews are white, that Jews equal white. And being a woman of color and being Jewish, I'm constantly having to tell people that that's not necessarily the case.
But in most diaspora places other than Israel, the UK and the US, Jews are not white.
Right, but that's what I'm trying to bring up. The fact that here
it's cultural majority rather than color.
Right, and that's exactly my point, right? So people think that it is that way, that all Jews are white, but that's very geographic, right? So when I lived in Chicago and I would tell people that I was Jewish, they would say, wait, but I thought you were Puerto Rican. I didn't know there were Jews in Puerto Rico, right? I live in San Diego now, and when I say I'm Jewish, they say, oh, is your family from Mexico City? Or they say, oh, do you go to this shul? Because that's where there's a huge contingent of Mexican Jews, right? But they don't blink at the idea of there being Latinx Jews. And so I just want to remind everybody that we are not a monolith, that there are Jews of color all over the world, and that we speak a variety of languages. When I went to Israel many, many years ago for an ulpan, for a language immersion program, my instructor was an Indian woman whose family had been in Israel, I think, since the expulsion. In 1492, their family had been there. And so I just want to put that out there and just remind people that when you are defining Jewish, you need to make sure that you have an expansive definition of what Jewish is. Okay, so let's talk about some of the best and the worst representations. When panelists were all chatting before this panel, we talked about some of the lovely old chestnuts of anti-Semitism and stereotypes about Jews. So I am here to tell you that I do not own any shares in any bank or any newspaper. I do not have any good recipes for matzah made out of the blood of Christian babies. These are all really horrible stereotypes and lies and just horrible things that have been said about Jews. And unfortunately, these things have carried over into fiction, where at best it's a stereotype of, say, a greedy Jew, or a whole variety of misrepresentations. And so I want to get everybody's idea of one of each, if you can, one really terrible portrayal, so that everyone knows what to avoid, and then one really good portrayal of a Jewish character or of a Jewish theme. So Stephen, you want to go?
No.
Seriously, that was rhetorical.
I know. I need a few moments. Like I said, right before the panel started, everybody, I commented that I had completely forgotten everything that I had ever known about any book I've ever read. And so, as Isabel was giving the introduction, I'm quickly scrolling through the bibliography that I've trying to find, which ones I want to talk about. And frankly, I don't really keep track of the really bad representations of Jews in books. I tend to chuck those books across the room. I could give you the category, and that one is when people use Jewish characters to support an apocalyptic Christian view of the world. That's one of the things that really makes me want to throw the book across the room. When somebody's writing a Jewish character where the only thing they know about Jews seems to be Jews have to return to Israel in order for the second coming to happen. I don't want to have anything to do with that book. And that's going to be the kind of book that I would suggest, stay far away from this. One of the books that I did read recently, and hold on, trying to find it. Somebody else talk about something. I'll come back to the book that I'm going to recommend in a second or two.
Okay, well, I'd like to mention, oddly enough, I've been reading a number of books by authors who I don't believe are Jewish, like Robert Sawyer and the Oppenheimer alternative. But one of my favorites is, this is her latest one, Mary Robinette.
Oh, yes.
And The Calculating Stars, which is the first book in her Lady Astronaut series, which is an alternate history, is wonderful. And, to the point that I recommended the book to my rabbi. Now, in terms of negative portrayals, I could go
Wait, hold on a second. Dan, hold on a second. I actually would like to say that the second book, The Faded Stars, I think represents Judaism even better than The Faded Sky. Does an even better job.
I just picked up the third one in the series. I love the series. She's great. But in terms of negative portrayals, I could talk about, Fagin and Oliver Twist and Shylock, but that's not science fiction. I'm really pressed to think of negative portrayals of Jews in mainstream science fiction. I know about some of the, the Christian apocalyptic stuff that Steve was talking about, but I'm not reading that. The only one that comes to mind, and it was done as satire, and some people have misunderstood what the point of the book was Norman Spinrad's The Iron Dream, which is sort of like the ultimate alternate history. What if Hitler, instead of becoming dictator of Germany, became a science fiction writer? And the whole book is written through that lens. So there's a lot of very negative things in there, but deliberately so, because it's supposed to be a satiric what if alternate history.
Okay,
Valerie's
Valerie.
been writing longer than me, so can she go first?
Yeah, Valerie, please.
Yeah, I've got. All right, I made a list in advance. Okay, picture a little girl time traveling with a magic tallit. Yes, that's Ruth Tenzer Feldman's The Blue Thread. Yes, I will post these names. You don't have to write them all down. It's a trilogy. We get Sephardic Jews in there from Seattle. It's just so gorgeous and sweet. And that was, the book I wanted to exist when I was a kid. A couple others, quickly. Rossner's The Sisters of the Winter Wood was just gorgeous and sweet. If you're one of the people saying Naomi Novik is wonderful, yes, she is, but so's this one, same thing. Zubrin's The Holy Land was the best metaphor for what happened, the Palestinian conflict in Israel I've ever seen. And it's a story about aliens invading Washington, and was just very clever, I thought.
Washington State.
Yes. And Zadig by David Rosenbaum, I picked up on a sale table, and that one is a secular Jew who becomes Orthodox to be the chosen one and fight vampire Hitler. Okay, that sounded so weird, but it was really well done. I will post those. And for a negative one, moving over to TV, I think it was last December or maybe the year before, an awful lot of people were so excited because Disney's Elena of Avalor was going to do a Hanukkah episode with Elena meeting Sephardic Jews who were going to teach her. It's a very South American Mexican with the serial numbers filed off show, was going to teach them how to do Hanukkah. So we were all, right by our TV sets. And then this girl shows up. It's not offensive. She does Hanukkah, but she speaks so much Yiddish and had very little Sephardic stuff going on that a lot of us were just staring, going, wasn't this written in LA? You couldn't get any sensitivity readers. So sometimes it just comes out very culturally strange.
That leads into one of the questions that we have about who can write. Yeah, I just want to make this point. One of the questions is about who can write Jewish fiction, whether that is, must it be written by Jews? Can non-Jews write it? And so I want to just keep that in mind as we're going through that, because that's a great point about, by definition, Sephardic Jews wouldn't be speaking Yiddish. And so that's a great example of getting it wrong. Not getting it bad necessarily, but getting it wrong. And so we'll talk about that when we do the questions. All right, Jillian.
So I'm only going to give 2 examples of good, and then I'm going to give you a study I did a few years ago as a reason why I'm not giving the bad ones. So when people asked me what they should read, I sent them to Jane Yolen and Briar Rose as their first step into the show for speculative fiction readers, and I sent them to anything by Peter S. Beagle, because that's, to me, that's it feels so Jewish. I don't have to explain it to them. If they get it, they get writing as a Jew. But why I don't have the negatives is not that I don't have negatives. I have a lot of negatives, but because I did a little study for historical fiction conference paper a few years ago on Australian young adult authors and their works and how Jews appeared and in what contexts, whether they were spec fic or not, all young adult works that were published over a certain period. It was 100 works in toto. And the only places that had Jewish characters were works where Jews were dealing with Holocaust stuff, so Shoah, whether it was by someone Jewish or not, there was always Shoah. And the other one was ultra-Orthodox. Now, the Australian Jewish population is officially 113,000, probably 200,000 or 250,000 in reality, because there's a lot of, we hide ourselves a bit here right now. So neither of these are representative of who we are in Australia. We have a large number of Shoah survivors, much larger per capita than anywhere outside Israel. So that makes sense why this is a story theme, but why only those two? So the publicly acceptable Jews are Fagin because of Oliver Twist, Shylock because always Shakespeare, Chassids, and Shoah survivors. You have to have been through something, and anything else is not permitted. So you can't do good depiction of Jew. You can have a perfectly good depiction of Jew that falls into one of these categories and reinforces the fact that there are limited varieties of Jews, that we don't have the huge cultural diversity that we actually do have. And that's why I don't give examples of bad depictions except privately. I try not to.
Okay,
And
and
get into your next question, actually, didn't it?
yeah, I think it's really interesting how each of these questions and then each of the comments keeps bringing us back to things we've said before about how expansive Jews and Jewish science fiction and Jewish themes and Jewish content all are. You can't pigeonhole it as just one thing or another. And so one of the things about not pigeonholing it and not restricting it is this idea of who can write it. So somebody in the comments or in the questions asked about because we mentioned about non-Jews being able to write Jewish fiction, how is it that non-Jews can write Jewish fiction when other people can't necessarily write about something that they're not? And so I want to just recommend the book Writing the Other. You can write about anything, right? When people say, oh, write what you know, it's like, well, how many of us really know what it feels like to be an alien? How many of us really know what it feels like to have tentacles? Anyone? Right?
Well,
Of course not.
Isabel, I think what it comes down to is when you're writing the other, the important thing is to be respectful, to do your research, to have sensitivity readers.
Exactly.
Jillian, before we started, you were talking about a Writing the Other book was it that you put out?
It's my current research. So I was given a grant to finish a book on how we embed culture in fiction without knowing, and what that means for people interpreting our fiction. I was trying to work out where the alt-right people got, how they got the vast problem stuff from the same books we're reading and not getting problem stuff from. I want to see how we shape culture. That's my academic specialization. It's ethnohistory and it's shaping culture. And right now I'm using contemporary stuff because it's bugging me the amount of hate around. I am so very Jewish, it's not funny. But in fiction terms, it's taken me, I've been a writer a fair while, but I'm only just visible in North America now because my Jewishness isn't noticeable to a lot of North Americans. This accent is not a Jewish accent. When I studied in Toronto, people said, are you sure you're Jewish? Or when did your family convert? Or there are no Jews in Australia. And it's only in the last 12 months that I haven't had to face that, as I'm fine as a Jewish fan who's Australian, not so good as a Jewish writer who's Australian. It's really interesting.
And picking up on the Australia theme, someone also asked about Israeli science fiction. We tend to talk here a lot about fiction written in English, but there's also a huge Israeli science fiction community. I remember one of my first World Cons, I met a bunch of Israeli Jews, and we talked about the Israeli science fiction that was happening there. I think one of the problems is that so much really good work that's out there in the world isn't translated into English. And that means that the majority of North American science fiction fandom isn't reading it. And, the way that the publishing world works, the way that fandom works is if it's not in English, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And so that's a real shame. And we really need to, if any of you have, I'm sure Stephen does, but if you all have recommendations for Israeli science fiction, I think that would be great to put out there.
There's an anthology out that I wrote about when I was editor of a Jewish weekly in Boston. And it wasn't until I said the title out loud that it hit me what it was: Zion's Fiction. And when I said out loud, I groaned for like 5 minutes. It was like, oh my, I can't believe I missed that. But yes, very, very clever title, and it's a collection of Israeli works.
The editor is Sheldon Teitelbaum.
Shout out to David Grossman's Sea Under Love. By the way, I found a lot of Israeli lit translated into English in the mainstream section, not the sci-fi section. But once you know the names, you can go find it. Sea Under Love was just a gorgeous meditation on growing up in the shadow of the Holocaust and the lost writers of the Holocaust and so many different things.
Okay, great. So let's go to themes that have, actually, we're already at just a little bit past. Eric, can you give me a time check? I just want to make sure we're doing well here. Okay, all right. So let's talk about what you haven't seen. We've talked about what we have seen. Let's talk about what we haven't seen and would like to see. More characters, more content, a better handling of something. Valerie.
Yeah. I don't see a lot of prayer and religion and, doing Jewish religious stuff or worship in books. Almost all of this, and I just read so much, is about matzo balls and Yiddish jokes and growing up in the culture, or golems and dibbicks and that sort of thing. And it would also be fun to see more wrangling about halacha, the rules about, how do you worship in a spaceship and so on and so forth. Shout out to Ann and Jeff Vandermeer's The Kosher Guide to Imaginary Animals, but we don't have a lot beyond that.
Okay, then I got to plug my book now, Father of the Bride of Frankenstein, because I made a point of the Frank, the monster, decides they're going to get serious about it, and they go to services and they go through a whole conversion process. And at one point, the rabbi's explaining that even though he's a reanimated corpse who may be circumcised, there will have to be a ritual circumcision, and I play it for laughs. But I did try to get it right. And it was funny when my rabbi read the book, and she's from Israel. And I asked her, did I get the details right? Because the challenge for me was explaining things, but the narrator, the father, knows less than I do. So it was an interesting challenge to write. But in any case, my rabbi, to give you an idea of the cultural difference, she said she learned something new, which surprised me. As they're planning the music for the wedding, I have a whole big thing about how they can't use the wedding march, but or the recessional by Wagner or Mendelssohn. And the mother's going, why? And they explain about Wagner was, Hitler's favorite composer and everything. And my rabbi, who had grown up in Israel, she'd never heard that before because it just never came up to use that kind of wedding music, where in the United States, at least, it's almost a given, and people are often surprised when it's not heard at a Jewish wedding.
Great.
A lot of the stories in the Dan anthologies, Wandering Stars and More Wandering Stars, do focus on halakha. I think that a lot of them are dated, though, in so many ways, the writing style and everything. But Dan, we were talking earlier about Mary Robinette Kowal's books, and they do get into the halakha about how you worship when you're on a spaceship. What does it mean? What are you allowed to do? If you have to work on Shabbat in order to not die, obviously you have to work on Shabbat. But those are things that are discussed in the book. And Mary Robinette did, and you mentioned recommending it to your rabbi. I suggested it to my wife's Hadassah book group. Unfortunately, after the first book I suggested to them, they said that I'm not allowed to suggest books anymore.
I did some
Okay.
homework for this panel, but it was Gillian-ish homework. It wasn't reading something I knew. It was finding out, since I knew I was going to say there aren't many Jewish spec fic writers in Australia, and I've investigated that fairly thoroughly because I'm an active part of fandom here, I asked my fan friends in a lot of the not known Jewish world or less known Jewish world how many Jewish spec fic writers they knew, who they knew, and I was going to make lists of them, and I thought there'd be a few dozen, but no, there are 3, and we're talking about 2 continents. I would like to, I don't believe that there are no Jewish spec fic writers in Europe or in Southeast Asia, or one for Finland we got, that was it, or Sweden, I forget. I'll have to check that out. It's on my Facebook thing, all of the questions and answers about it. I would like to see Jewish writers from the less known parts of the world, like, Europe, read by the Jewish world and actually be visible as Jewish writers. And I suspect one of the reasons they're not is because it's not always safe to be publicly Jewish. And it's easier to write Jewish themes and be seen as culturally neutral. What's the way of saying when so I would like to see an end to the silencing, and that's an impossibility. It's not going to happen, but I'd like to at least see a few of the writers who are doing interesting work outside North America and Britain, where we do have a good knowledge.
I've got a great question to follow up on Valerie's point. I was about to call on Valerie, so that's why I'm bringing this up. This lack of understanding about what Jews actually do, or what Judaism is. Do we think that has to do with secular Jews growing up in the U.S. and that particular point of view that everyone sees of a secular Jew? How is that, or is that one of the reasons why we get this very thin portrayal where there isn't a lot of depth? And I know that that's kind of big, and I just want to point out that we've only got 6 minutes left. So like just a lightning thing here on how do we think the fact that the general U.S. view of Judaism is a secular one, how does that get reflected in the literature?
I don't think that's it. I just think there's a lot to do. I mean, if you're writing Jewish science fiction, you've also got to do your science fiction plot and so on and so
Right.
forth. There was a Babylon 5 episode where the rabbi shows up and asks, is the space fish kosher? And Ivanova, who's Jewish, goes, I don't know. And he shrugs and eats it. Some people were annoyed, but it was pointed out that if we have the kosher discussion, that could take like 20 minutes of an episode that's supposed to be about other things.
I would actually love the 20-minute episode. And what I mean by that is, I like, enough with the Holocaust. Like, can we never talk about it again? And I don't mean that because it was a horrific experience. I'm talking about it because it's like, we Jews do things other than sit around and cry about the Holocaust, right? We do other things besides Hanukkah. There is an entire calendar that has nothing to do with Hanukkah. And so I would actually love to see Babylon 5 or any other show delve into that. And Babylon 5 did do some stuff when her father died. She sat Shiva, which I thought was fantastic.
Yes, and the amazing thing was J. Michael Straczynski is an avowed atheist, and he did some of the most sensitive stuff about Judaism and other religions as well.
Yeah, and I would love to see some of that. You see in some other science fiction where there are Christian characters that are deeply religious, and they go through a crisis of faith. One of my all-time favorite books is The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell. And as a person of faith, that book will just tear your heart out. It is so painful, and it deals with one man's crisis of faith, and he is a Jesuit priest, right? This isn't anything subtle, and this is not the only book where we see someone who is clearly identified as a religious person, clearly identified as a person of deep faith, and that's explored in a way that it's never explored in Judaism. And so that's one of the things that I would like. I would also like more time in the panel, but we only have 5 minutes remaining. I just got the 5-minute warning. So I want each of us to go through and just do a quick, a lightning last statement. Stephen.
Yes, last statement.
Exactly right. 1 minute. You can do this.
Well, I'm going to do this for the next minute. We are lucky. There is a lot of Jewish science fiction fantasy out there. A lot of it is very well done, and we're seeing more of it as we go on, not just from Jewish writers, but from other writers who want to explore our culture also, and frequently do a reasonably good job of it. I know that the experience that we have here in the United States is nothing at all compared to the experience that Jillian has down in Australia. But I'm also always very aware that we are not a majority culture, and at best we pass, and that can change at any moment. And I think that that's been very obvious relatively recently. So the fact that it's out there and it's still being published is great. Going back into one of Dan's areas, it always amazes me that the first talkie, in the United States was a Jewish film.
Yeah, the jazz
singer. The fact that the first talkie was about a guy whose family wanted him to be a cantor and he wanted to rebel does show that, the culture, even when anti-Semitism was at a high, still looked at Jews and considered what we were going through and trying to interpret our culture and our religion.
Okay, I'm going to go through the order of my screen now. So Daniel?
Okay, very quickly, what I want in science fiction is the same thing that I ask when I do a lecture on Jewish Hollywood in the movies. Show us the whole wide range of the Jewish experience. Belief and non-belief. Orthodox, conservative, reform, reconstructionist, renewal. Give us, not every story has to do all of that, but let's see that whole wide range. I'm tired of seeing a movie and now here's the rabbi and it's an Orthodox rabbi with a long white beard because that's the only way they can picture it. Mm-hmm. Show us everything. My rabbi is an Israeli woman.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Valerie.
Keeping the faith. First, well, not first romantic rabbi lead, but it mixed it up. We need diverse books campaign with American publishers. I'm seeing a lot more Jewish sci-fi and more Jewish children's books and more Jewish mixed race characters in children's books. So now's a great time to publish it. Send it to people.
And that publishing it, that was actually a question that somebody had about how to publish. It was a writer who had said how to publish. So we're not going to have time to get to that. But if the panelists want to maybe throw something into the chat that then can get put into the Discord, because that is definitely, if we talk about what we want to see, we want to make sure that these great new voices, these great diverse voices get heard. So I'm going to just put that push out there, that plug out there for everyone on the panel. If you can think of, any publishing tips and tricks, put them in the chat so that then our chat wrangler can put them out on the Discord. All right. Jillian, really quick, because I think we're down to 1 minute.
There are a whole bunch of things I want to say about the previous questions. I'm going to try to fit it all into 1 minute. Look at how Judaism appears to the rest of the world. So US Judaism, I always describe it as, because I teach this stuff, this is not how everybody writes, it's how it appears as a major set of categories, right? Woody Allen versus Fiddler on the Roof, those are the two major categories that the rest of the world sees about US Judaism. And I'd like to say that Anglo-Australian Judaism is HMS Pinafore. So it's not, the choices that US writers make impact how the rest of us see Judaism all over the world, because you're the flag bearers for the English language. And that's
Okay.
what I have time to tell you about that one. Sorry.
Fantastic. That's great. All right. So time is up. I encourage, if any of the panelists have time, if you're not going to be on another panel, to go check out the Discord. I'm sure there's lots of comments that that we missed or that people would like addressed. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you everyone for participating. Hopefully we'll see each other. As half asleep as I am. Okay. All right, everybody. Thanks. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Right.
To the Discord.